lovely people, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be talking about Saturn, which is a topic that's been requested by so many of you. I filmed a video about Saturn like ages ago, years ago. I'm gonna link it in the description box down below, but I know it's been a trending topic in astrological circles lately, and I think that's partly due to the fact that millennials as a generation are very interested in astrology, and a lot of millennials are either going through their Saturn return at the moment, or they are getting very close to it, like myself. It's gonna start for me in 2020. Or they've just gone through their Saturn return and they're like, what the hell just happened? Why did all of this happen to me now? So today we're going to be talking not about the Saturn return. That's a topic that I'm going to say for another video. Today we're going to be discussing about Saturn and its placement in your natal chart, and in particular the placement by house. So I'm going to do another video with Saturn and its placement in all 12 zodiac signs, but today we're going to be discussing about Saturn's placement in the houses in astrology. Now, first of all, what you need to do is you need to know what house your natal Saturn is placed in. How can you find that out? So you need your date, your date, time, and place of birth, and you can use one of those online natal chart generators. I'm actually going to link one in the description box down below. You put in your birthday details and you've got your natal chart in front of you, and all you need to do is you need to look for the symbol of Saturn and see where it's placed, and we can take it from there. Now, a little bit about Saturn before we get into the nitty-gritty. Saturn in mythology, in Greek mythology, was known as Cronus. Saturn is actually the seventh of the traditional planets. So before Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were discovered, Saturn was actually the last of the planets out of the 7 planets that were known to people and that they operated with in astrology. That's why Saturn has always been symbolically associated with boundaries and the end of time, and also with death, because that's the end for humans. Well, actually, that's such a wide topic, and I'm not going to get into that. I don't believe that death is actually the end for any of us. It's just the end of our physical body and of our memories, of the memories of our ego. But going back to Saturn, Saturn is associated in astrology with boundaries, with difficulties. It's associated with the law. Hence the association with difficulties, because we need, as humans, and the world needs boundaries. Otherwise, there would be chaos. So it's Saturn that is associated with the need for boundaries, with the need for laws, with the need for rules, for regulations. Saturn is also associated with tradition and caution. Saturn in a natal chart can also be associated with the father figure, and arguably we've got like astrologers associating the sun and astrologers associating Saturn with the father figure. I'd say it depends, and both of them have something of the father figure. Saturn is associated with figures in authority more than anything else. So it's the authority. Saturn is the status quo, why things are done in a certain way. Saturn is the taskmaster. It's the professor that puts us to work and that presents us with challenges that ultimately help us grow. Now, in mythology, Saturn, aka Cronus, in Greek mythology, toppled his father, Uranus, because Uranus was going a little bit crazy, and Saturn took the throne from him and castrated Uranus, because Uranus was creating all these children with Gaia, with Mother Earth, and because they didn't look that pretty, he would shove them back into Gaia's womb, and Gaia's like, Jesus, I've had enough. Saturn, just go rid us of your father. So Saturn took the throne from his father, and that was all good and fine until Saturn started having children of his own. And because he was very scared that they would topple him in the same way that he did with his father, what did he do? So he started swallowing his children. But ultimately, he was outsmarted by his wife, and his wife managed to save Jupiter, aka Zeus, who ended up taking the throne from Saturn. And that's where my mythological knowledge ends. Now, going back to what Saturn represents in the natal chart, it represents an area where we have a lot of work to put into. It's not an area that we feel comfortable in. It's an area that brings us in our lives a lot of anxiety. It might make us feel like we are not adequate, like we are not good enough. Saturn is associated with fear, so we can actually be afraid of the things that a certain house in our chart represents. But ultimately, Saturn in the natal chart represents the ultimate material challenge that we need to overcome. And if we overcome it, we're going to be rewarded for it. But do we have it in us to put in the discipline and the time and the effort to become so good at it that we end up reaping the rewards? It's very paradoxical that we put so much work into something that we think we're not good at, and we end up becoming the authority in it. I'd say it's beautiful. It's not just paradoxical. So what happens if you've got Saturn in the first house in your natal chart? Well, I'd say you probably come across as someone who is very cautious, very reserved. Some people might even call you cold. That's because you are very much aware of how other people perceive you with Saturn in the first house, and you have this innate fear of not being good enough, of not being adequate, of not being up to task. You might feel like there is like a strong, like there's some sort of like magnifying glass on you, and it's magnifying all your flaws, and everyone is conscious of your flaws, and you feel so bad about it. So Saturn in the first house people are usually very strict with themselves. They have incredibly high standards of themselves, and they tend to beat themselves up. They put a lot of pressure on themselves, and they beat themselves up for every single flaw, for every single mistake, for every single misstep. Now, on the other hand, people with Saturn in the first house can come across as authorities in whatever field they are in. So people around them think of them that they are someone who knows what they're talking about, who knows what they're doing, so they come across as being very competent. That's because generally they are very competent because they are so afraid of not being adequate that they put a lot of effort into becoming the best version of themselves that they can be. It can be a very cold and dark place to have Saturn in the first house because you feel like you're never good enough. You struggle with self-confidence, and it's a journey, it's a learning process. You feel like you never know enough and you're never good enough to be proud of yourself. But ultimately, the older you get, the more comfortable with yourself you start to become. But that is only if you put a lot of work on yourself and if you work on bettering and improving yourself. Now, in terms of like from a physical aspect point of view, because the first house is also the house of our body, people with Saturn in the first house tend to be on the slimmer end of the spectrum, on the thin and lean side, and you guys can have like a very beautiful prominent bone structure because Saturn rules the bones. Last but not least, you probably come across as being a lot older than you really are, and people perceive you as being a lot older than you really are. That can be very helpful in a work environment, but if you are looking for fun and romance and entertainment, it might not be the best look out there. You can actually dress as if you are older, and you act as if you are older, which, like I said, can serve you well in certain circumstances, but not in all. Keep in mind, not in all of them. Now, if you've got Saturn in your second house, Jesus, you might be afraid more than anything of poverty. So Saturn in the second house people probably have experienced poverty at some point, either like in a past life. It doesn't have to have happened in this life, but one of their main fears in this lifetime is not having money or being poor, and that's why their sense of security is very much attached to money and how much money they make. Also, your sense of self-worth is attached to material success. So if you don't make enough money in your eyes, and no matter how money you make, it's never going to be enough, so you have to like work a little bit on that. You might feel like you're not worthy, you are not valuable, and it doesn't matter what you do unless you make money out of it. So you might have like I don't want to say crazy fear, an unjustified fear, but certainly a magnified fear of poverty. Sorry about the alarm, guys. There is an ambulance going right past my flat right now. Saturn in the second house can also have an impact upon the things that you consider valuable. So I would say with this placement, you probably place a lot of value on tradition, on the tried and tested, on enforcing rules. You're very good at enforcing rules, and you're probably a very disciplined person yourself, because discipline is something that you consider valuable and that you appreciate in others, and other people appreciate in you. So there's definitely a silver lining over there. Now, if you've got Saturn in the third house, you might have had to deal with learning difficulties. So primary school might not have, either learning difficulties or with a very cold environment, especially in primary school and in early childhood. So school might not have seemed like a friendly place for you to be in. You might have felt isolated, you might have felt alone, maybe you felt like you didn't have the right communication skills. So with Saturn in the third house, these people are usually, oh my gosh, guys, there's all these alarms around me. Sorry. Sorry about the noise. So with Saturn in the third house, the child, because we're talking about the very primary manifestation of the placement, the child might have been very cautious about what came out of their mouth, because they were very afraid of not being thought of as fools, as stupid, as not smart enough. So there is definitely a fear of being considered not smart enough. Now, what's that gonna result? What's that gonna result into? What's that gonna manifest itself into later down the line? Whatever domain you choose to study, you're probably gonna give it your 100%, your 200%, and you're gonna become an authority in it, so that there is no danger of you being considered stupid when you communicate and when you open up your mouth. Now, people with this placement might have also struggled with speech difficulties earlier down in life, or they might have struggled with a feeling of not being heard. So whatever they said, it was as if they were speaking in front of a blank wall, and no one paid attention to what they were talking about. Now, Saturn in the fourth house, in my experience, with the clients that I've dealt with and that have had this placement, most of them confirmed that they came from a poor environment, or money was scarce, or resources of some shape or form were scarce. It always felt like there wasn't enough, and everyone had to hold off on using resources, hold off on spending money. There was a feeling of not having enough. Conversely, with Saturn in the first house, the growing up environment might not have felt very nurturing. It might have felt very cold emotionally, and the father might have been experienced as being particularly cold. So when we need the most amount of nurturing and support and feeling like there's someone there for us, that's in childhood, and people with Saturn in the fourth house might not have received that. what happens with this placement is generally people are very adamant about creating a very strong family foundation for themselves, and they put a lot of effort into creating a family of their own so that they can make up for what they missed out on when they were young. Now, what if you've got your Saturn in the 5th house? Generally, people with Saturn here tend to have a hard time in letting go and enjoying themselves. So they are so scared of losing control and of coming across as being someone who is like too loose, too out there, who doesn't have like a tight grip on their passions and their creativity. So they tend to hold themselves off and never let go completely. That's why they're having such a hard time generally enjoying themselves. Now with Saturn in the 5th house, you might actually enjoy working. So that is a safe space, and you feel like you can dedicate yourself completely to it. So you might actually take a lot of pleasure in work. Very unusual, I know. Now, with Saturn in the 5th, you might also have a hard time allowing yourself to fall in love and allowing yourself to like flirt and enjoy the pleasures that love can bring. Because of all of these reasons, you might actually end up studying a lot about love and pleasure and creativity and how you can harness it. And it will feel like you need to use a very methodical approach to all these 5th house domains and topics before you can actually experience them. Last but not least, Saturn in the 5th house might have children later in life because they can be quite afraid that they're not a good enough parent, or that they're not going to be a good enough parent and their children are not going to love them. So they tend to postpone that. But Saturn represents something in our life that we actually need to deal with. And it's one of the main challenges that we have to overcome in this lifetime. So as much as you postpone it, you can't postpone it forever. So you have to address the issues of the house where Saturn is placed in. And if that has to do with creativity, if that has to do with children, if that has to do with enjoying yourself, you cannot continually postpone it because you're only going to create more frustration in your life. Now, if you've got Saturn in the 6th house, congratulations, you are what they call a workaholic. You might put a lot of unnecessary pressure on yourself when it comes to day-to-day work, and you might feel like even like the easiest, simplest admin side of things is like a burden. So like taking out the trash, doing the household chores, it might feel like an incredible burden, and you might beat yourself up because you spend too much time doing these things, or you take too much time doing these things. So there can be a complete like disconnect. I mean, I'm not saying that anyone enjoys doing the chores, like we probably all hate them, but for Saturn in the 6th house person, it is actually taking an emotional toll, which it shouldn't. The work itself, so in whatever domain you do work, I have to say you are fantastic at using resources properly, at allocating resources properly, at disciplining others, at bringing order into the workplace. You probably also take on a lot of responsibilities in the workplace, and then you feel overburdened by them, but it's a situation that you've created for yourself, you know. Last but not least, the 6th house also deals with health-related issues. So this can be the placement of the hypochondriac. I think that's the right word. So people who diagnose themselves and think, oh my gosh, I've got all the diseases in the world. There's nothing to be scared about. Health-wise, you might have some issues with your teeth and your bones and your skin, because these are all ruled by Saturn. So what you will need to do in order to ensure that your skin, teeth and bones are healthy is allocate a lot of time and resources and discipline when it comes to the routine that you apply to them. Last but not least, this placement is perfect for someone who works in the wellness industry and in the health industry. So for a doctor, for instance, or for the health freak. So someone who applies ginormous amounts of discipline to what they eat and how they work out and how they treat their bodies. Now, if you've got Saturn in the 7th house, I say one of your challenges in this lifetime is learning to connect with the other person and make compromises for the sake of the relationship. It might feel like relationships don't just happen for you. You have to put a lot of work into them, and partnerships require a lot of effort and attention and discipline from you, and that's fine because they probably will. So you're going to have to learn how to compromise. You're going to have to learn how to give the other person what they need. You're going to have to learn a lot about the dynamic of relationships in general. Saturn in the 7th is also associated with marriage later in life or marriage with an older partner. Now, last but not least, the marriage and the partnership and even business partnerships, because the 7th house rules committed partnerships in general. Partnerships can be felt as an area that brings a lot of mental pressure. But generally, that pressure is usually in your own head. Also, you might want to adhere to very strict social conventions when it comes to marriage and partnerships. And it can feel like there are a lot of limitations as to who you can choose as a partner, what that partner has to be like, and it feels like society and family have all these expectations from you regarding the partner that you do choose. So it feels like your hands are tied and you can't actually just be with whoever you want to be. But remember, a lot of it is just in your head, as many other things. And reality just ends up matching what we have in our heads already. Now, with Saturn in the 8th house, there is fear of sharing resources. So there is fear of sharing money with another person, especially the person that we are in a partnership with. There is fear of letting go of our power, because the 8th house is also our power and our secrets. So there is a lot of reluctance around letting go of these things. It's like you're running away from giving yourself to another person completely because you don't want to give away your power, but actually what's required of you in this lifetime is precisely to give this power away and to share it with the other person, because otherwise you won't be able to fully merge with the other person. Saturn in the 8th can also mean can also bring some sort of like inheritance from the males in your life, but that is likely going to happen very late in life, so when you're probably old already. Saturn in the 8th can also bring a lot of obstacles when it comes to enjoying your sex life, because there are all these preconceived limitations and boundaries and what's right and what's wrong and what's expected of me, and enjoying my sex life is oh so hard. So there is also difficulty in allowing yourself to enjoy this side of life. But as with all areas where we've got Saturn in our chart, through study, through discipline, through pushing yourself, through committing to something, it is likely that further down the line you're going to become an expert in all these things. Last but not least, Saturn in the 8th house is fantastic at taking care of other people's money. So it can be a fantastic banker or accountant, because you are so cautious about other people's money, you're going to take really good care of them. Saturn in the 9th house. So what does this bring? It might bring some sort of like fear or reluctance to traveling and to opening yourself up to other cultures and seeing how other people live and seeing a different world out there. It might feel like that world is not so safe. It gives you a lot of like internal insecurity. You might have like this internal reluctance to engage with foreigners. Similarly, with Saturn in the ninth house, it might feel like it is your duty, because Saturn has to do with duty, to learn and to follow like higher education, even though it might feel like out of reach. So university and access to university and higher education might not be something that is easily accessible to you, and therefore it becomes one of the main challenges that you have to deal with in this lifetime. It's also possible with Saturn in the ninth that your system of like religious reference and your life philosophy is very strict, and you grew up in a very strict religious environment, because the ninth house also rules religion, so like an ultra orthodox environment. Last but not least, you might be looking for concrete answers that you can apply in the real world when it comes to religion and philosophy and politics. Saturn in the 10th house. Saturn in the 10th house is at home, guys. And even though a lot of people come to me and they say, oh, I've got Saturn in the 10th house, it's going to be so hard for me to succeed from a career point of view, I say no. I say Saturn in the 10th house is very well placed for you to give your all to your career, to work hard, to be rewarded for it, because let's not forget, if we do put in the work and if we do prove ourselves disciplined enough and willing enough to like sacrifice things that are not a priority for us, because ultimately Saturn is about cutting back on things and prioritizing things. So your priority will probably be in your career, in this lifetime, your career, and it will feel like something that you need to give your all to. But your reward is going to be the fact that you're going to become a boss, very likely. You're going to become a figure of authority, and you will be rewarded for it further down the line. And it's very possible that you're going to leave behind a tangible material legacy in the field that you choose to build a career in. Saturn in the 11th house. Oh my gosh, you guys, you're probably scared to like form friendships, because you get all awkward around people, and especially in large groups of people. So Saturn in the 11th house is likely going to have a handful of friends, but they're going to have these friends for life, because once you do become friends with someone, there is no one more reliable and more responsible than you are when it comes to maintaining the friendship. It's also possible that you're going to make friends with people who are older than you, or people who are in authority positions. Last but not least, be very careful, because your dreams might seem like the most unattainable thing out there. They're not. And Saturn, actually, having Saturn in the 11th house, I think is a really good sign that if you do put in the work for your dreams, they will materialize, because Saturn is a planet of materialization, of bringing things into the physical realm. So use that, my lovely Saturn in the 11th house friends. Now, last but not least, Saturn in the 12th house might make you quite apprehensive, quite scared of the spiritual side of life, and might make you quite scared of even acknowledging the existence of spirituality out there. But in order for you to grow, and in order for you to not feel like life is unnecessarily hard for you and that you have to carry the burden of the world on your shoulders, you do have to get in touch with a higher consciousness, and you do have to get in touch with the universe and realize that actually the only escape for you is spiritual. Guess what? The only way for you out of this life filled with tension and anxiety and frustration and challenges and obstacles, because it might feel, with Saturn in the 12th house, I have to say, it's a very karmic placement, and it might feel like you have to deal with a lot of shit and clean up after a lot of people, not because you've done anything wrong, just because you're the only person out there who can do it, and you feel responsible in some shape or form for what's happening. This is a very, what I call, guilty placement. So you feel guilt without actually having done anything wrong. You might carry this guilt from like a previous life, but what you need to realize is, yes, you will have to sacrifice yourself for other people in this lifetime, and the only way that's gonna sit well with you, and it's not gonna turn you crazy over time and turn you very sour and very bitter is turning to the spiritual side of things. I advise setting out like a schedule and setting out a routine for you and for your spiritual practice. So be it like meditation for like 10 minutes every day, every morning, or every week you allocate an hour to yourself to like read into like alternative ways of like healing yourself. But I do think that this is gonna help you tremendously. So accepting the spiritual side of things, accepting that life is not so much in our control as we think it is. And yes, sometimes we do have to clean up after ourselves and after other people, even though we've done nothing wrong and we shouldn't be there in the first place. So, my lovelies, please tell me what house your Saturn is placed in and how that manifests on a day-to-day level. So my Saturn, for instance, is placed in the 8th house, just FYI. And I'm very reluctant to sharing my money, just FYI. Let me know how Saturn in your life is playing out. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please subscribe, because there is more content where this came from. Thank you for watching. Bye.